Same parents, same house, same bedtime stories, and yet, somehow, two completely different human beings. If you have more than one child, you already know this in your bones. Your firstborn reads the instructions. Your secondborn loses the instructions and figures it out anyway. Your firstborn asks permission. Your secondborn asks forgiveness. And you've probably wondered late at night when the house is finally quiet, did I do something differently? Did something happen? Or were they just born this way? Here's what decades of developmental research actually show. The differences are real, they are measurable, and they begin earlier than most parents ever suspect. We're talking about differences in language development, cognitive wiring, risk tolerance, and social behavior. And the mechanisms behind them are far more fascinating than the oldest got more attention. Stay with me, because the last section of this video contains the finding that genuinely surprised me most, and it will completely change how you think about sibling dynamics in your own home. Let's start with the cognitive gap, because it's real, it's documented, and it's almost certainly not caused by what most parenting articles claim. For decades, researchers tracking large populations of children noticed something consistent. Firstborn children tend to score slightly higher on standardized cognitive assessments than their later-born siblings. The Norwegian economists V. Joseph Hotz and Juan Pantano, working with data from hundreds of thousands of siblings, found this pattern repeating across different countries, different income levels, and different family structures, not by massive margins, but consistently and in the same direction. The instinctive explanation is resources. Firstborns get more money, more time, more focused attention before the second child arrives. And that's partially true, but it doesn't explain the whole picture, because the gap doesn't disappear in wealthy families where resources aren't stretched. Something else is happening. The more compelling explanation comes from what developmental psychologists call the tutoring effect. When a firstborn child is the only child in the house, they receive something extraordinarily rare in human development: sustained adult-level conversation directed entirely at them. Every question they ask is answered by an adult. Every word they mispronounce is gently corrected by an adult. Every story they try to tell is patiently received by an adult. This matters because early language input is one of the most powerful predictors of cognitive development we have. The quality and complexity of adult speech directed at a child, what researchers call child-directed speech, shapes vocabulary growth, working memory, and even later reading comprehension in ways that persist well into adolescence. But here's what makes this genuinely interesting. The firstborn doesn't just receive this input passively. Later, when the second child arrives, the firstborn becomes a teacher. And teaching, explaining something to someone younger, is one of the most cognitively demanding things a developing brain can do. You have to retrieve information, organize it, simplify it, and monitor whether the other person understood. That process strengthens the firstborn's own understanding in ways that solo learning simply doesn't. So the firstborn advantage isn't really about being first. It's about the specific quality of the conversational environment that firstborns inhabit, and then the cognitive workout of becoming an older sibling. Drop a 1 in the comments if you're a firstborn. Drop a 2 if you're a second. I genuinely want to see if what I'm about to describe matches your own experience. Here's a finding that surprises almost every parent when they first hear it. Second-born children, on average, hear fewer adult words per day than firstborns did at the same age. Not because their parents love them less, not because anyone is neglecting them, but because a significant portion of the language now flowing through their home is coming from a child, their older sibling. And child-directed speech from a 5-year-old is very different from child-directed speech from an adult. Researchers studying language acquisition have documented what some call the sibling interference effect. When a second-born child is learning to talk, a large percentage of their conversational input comes from an older sibling who is still developing their own grammatical complexity, vocabulary range, and sentence structure. The older child's language, however enthusiastic and loving, is simpler, shorter, and less grammatically varied than what a parent would provide. This doesn't mean second-borns are at a disadvantage forever. What it means is that their language development follows a different trajectory. They tend to reach certain early vocabulary milestones slightly later than firstborns, but they often develop something that pure adult input doesn't easily produce: the ability to navigate ambiguous, fast-moving, emotionally charged conversation with someone who doesn't always make sense, because talking to a 4-year-old sibling is genuinely hard. The topic changes without warning. The logic doesn't always follow. The emotional stakes are high. That toy is important right now. Second-born children become remarkably skilled at reading communicative intent from incomplete information. They learn to infer meaning from gesture, tone, and context in ways that children raised in more adult-dominated conversational environments sometimes take longer to develop. So when you notice your second-born seems to just get what you mean without you finishing the sentence, that's not magic. That's years of decoding an older sibling's imperfect but passionate communication. What's your experience? If you have 2 kids, does your younger one seem to read the room faster? Tell me in the comments, because the pattern I'm about to describe next is one of the most consistent findings in sibling research, and it connects directly to this. This is the one that every parent of multiple children nods at immediately. The second-born climbs higher, jumps sooner, tries the food without asking what's in it, walks up to strangers at the playground, and most parents chalk it up to personality. She's just bold, without realizing there's a documented developmental mechanism underneath it. Economists V. Joseph Hotz and Juan Pantano, whose sibling research tracked large longitudinal data sets, found that later-born children are measurably more likely to engage in risky behaviors across multiple domains, from physical risk-taking in childhood to financial and social risk-taking in adolescence and adulthood. This pattern has been replicated across different cultural contexts and economic backgrounds. But why? The most compelling explanation involves something researchers call parental risk calibration. With a firstborn child, parents have no reference point. Every fever feels catastrophic. Every tumble is examined for injury. Every developmental milestone is tracked against the chart. This is completely normal, and it communicates something subtle but powerful to the firstborn child. The world requires caution. Uncertainty deserves attention. By the time the second child arrives, parents have calibrated. They've learned that most tumbles are fine. That curiosity is generally safe. that a child's drive to explore is healthy, not dangerous. And so the second-born child grows up in a subtly different emotional climate, one where exploration is met with calm rather than alarm, where the parent's nervous system doesn't spike at every new attempt. That calmer parental response becomes the second-born's baseline. They internalize it, and it shapes their relationship with novelty and uncertainty in ways that persist well beyond childhood. If that hits something for you, if you've watched your second-born leap before looking while your firstborn stands at the edge thinking, leave a like, because I want the algorithm to show this to every parent who's ever wondered why their kids seem to come from different planets. Here's something that might sting a little, but it's important, and it's not a judgment. It's just what the data shows. Parents are not consistent across children, not because they're trying to be unfair, but because parenting is a skill. And like any skill, it changes with practice. What researchers have found across multiple longitudinal studies tracking parental behavior rather than just child outcomes is that parents apply different standards, different levels of monitoring, and different responses to the same behaviors depending on birth order. Firstborns are monitored more closely. Rules are enforced more strictly. Academic expectations are communicated more explicitly. This isn't favoritism. It's the natural result of parenting from a place of uncertainty. When you don't know yet what a child is capable of, you tend to scaffold more, supervise more, and intervene more. By the second child, parents have developed confidence. They've seen a child navigate the world and mostly come out fine, so they naturally step back. They let things play out longer before intervening. They're less likely to hover at the playground, less likely to re-explain instructions, less likely to check whether homework is done. The second-born child, as a result, develops independence earlier, not because they're more capable, but because the environment demands it. They problem solve alone more often. They negotiate with peers more often. They figure out their own systems because no one is quite as available to hand them a system. This creates a fascinating divergence. Firstborns often develop stronger executive function skills, the ability to plan, organize, and follow structured processes, partly because those skills were explicitly modeled and reinforced. Secondborns often develop stronger adaptive problem solving, the ability to improvise, read a situation, and find a workable solution with whatever's available, partly because they had to. Neither is better. They're different cognitive toolkits, shaped by different environments, and the parent created both of those environments without necessarily meaning to. Be honest with yourself right now. Do you parent your children differently? Not in terms of love, but in terms of rules, monitoring, expectations? Drop your thoughts in the comments. You're not alone in this, and the research says it's nearly universal. If what we've covered so far has made you look at your own children or your own childhood differently, that like button is right there. And honestly, what's coming in the next 4 sections is where this gets genuinely surprising. We're going to get into the social behavior differences, the long-term personality effects, and the one finding about second-born boys specifically that researchers did not expect. If you want to understand your kids at this level every week, subscribing takes 1 second, and it means you won't miss what's coming. Social development might be where the birth order effect is most visible and most misunderstood. Firstborn children tend to develop what developmental psychologists describe as adult-oriented social skills earlier and more robustly. This makes complete sense when you trace it back to their early environment. For the first years of their life, their primary social partners were adults. They learned to read adult facial expressions, respond to adult conversational cues, and navigate adult emotional states. They became fluent in the social language of people who are bigger, more powerful, and more verbally sophisticated than they are. This translates into specific observable behaviors. Firstborns tend to be more comfortable in structured social environments, classrooms, formal activities, adult-supervised settings. They tend to be more attuned to authority figures and more motivated by adult approval. They often emerge as natural leaders in organized contexts because they understand, intuitively, how to work within hierarchical structures. Second-born children develop something different, peer-oriented social fluency. Because they have always had to negotiate with someone closer to their own size and developmental level, someone who doesn't automatically defer to them, someone who has their own agenda and their own emotional weather. They become extraordinarily skilled at lateral social navigation, reading peers, finding compromise, managing conflict without an authority figure to appeal to. Experienced early childhood educators will often tell you they can spot the second-born in a room within minutes, not because they're louder or more disruptive, but because they're watching the group dynamics with a kind of relaxed social intelligence that children who've only navigated adult relationships don't yet have. This difference tends to persist. Research tracking social adjustment through adolescence consistently finds that later-born children report higher peer group integration and greater comfort with social ambiguity. Firstborns report higher comfort in structured, achievement-oriented social environments. Neither is a disadvantage. They're just different social fluencies. And understanding which one your child has naturally developed can help you give them the specific social experiences they might be missing. Personality research is complicated. Anyone who tells you birth order determines personality is selling you something. But what the longitudinal data does show, carefully with appropriate caveats, is that birth order is associated with consistent measurable tendencies across the Big Five personality dimensions. The Big Five, openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, are the most rigorously validated personality framework in psychological research. And when researchers have looked at where birth order shows up in this framework, the most consistent finding involves conscientiousness and openness. Firstborns across multiple large studies tend to score slightly higher on conscientiousness, the dimension associated with organization, self-discipline, reliability, and goal-directed behavior. This aligns perfectly with what we know about their developmental environment: structured adult interaction, explicit rule reinforcement, higher parental monitoring. Later-born children, by contrast, tend to score higher on openness to experience, the dimension associated with curiosity, creativity, willingness to challenge convention, and comfort with ambiguity. This also makes developmental sense. A child who grew up in a less monitored, more improvisational environment, who had to navigate the unpredictable social world of an older sibling who received fewer explicit rules and more implicit freedom. that child develops a different relationship with novelty and uncertainty. Historians and psychologists, most notably Frank Sulloway, in his research on birth order and intellectual history, have noted that later-born scientists and thinkers are disproportionately represented among those who championed radical new paradigms, the ones willing to challenge prevailing consensus. Firstborns are disproportionately represented among those who refined and systematized existing knowledge. Both matter enormously. Science needs both. What this means practically for parents: if your firstborn seems to struggle when the rules change unexpectedly, that's not rigidity. It's the personality architecture their environment helped build. If your secondborn seems to resist structure even when structure would genuinely help them, that's not defiance. It's the same mechanism working in reverse. Understanding that can change how you respond to both of them. This is the section I mentioned at the start, and I want to be precise here, because this finding generated a lot of headlines that oversimplified it, and oversimplifying it does a disservice to the actual science. In 2020, economists Joseph Doyle and Sanny Braining, along with colleagues, published research using a large Danish administrative data set, hundreds of thousands of sibling pairs tracked over decades. What they found, specifically among boys with older brothers, was a measurable increase in behavioral and disciplinary incidents compared to boys with older sisters or firstborn boys. The effect was specific to brothers with older brothers. Not all secondborns, not girls, not secondborns with older sisters, brothers with older brothers. The researchers proposed several explanations. One involves modeling. Boys with older brothers have a same-sex role model who is only a few years ahead of them, close enough to seem attainable, influential enough to shape behavior. If the older brother engages in risk-taking or rule testing, the younger brother observes that behavior at close range during critical developmental windows. Another explanation involves parental attention dynamics. When two boys are close in age, the parental attention available to each is more divided than in mixed-gender sibling pairs, where parents may naturally engage each child in different types of activities. Importantly, and this is what the headlines missed, the researchers were careful to note that this is a population-level statistical pattern, not a destiny. The effect size, while real, is modest, and it is substantially moderated by the quality of parental involvement, family stability, and the specific relationship between the brothers. What this finding actually tells us is something useful. The gender composition of a sibling pair matters for development in ways that go beyond birth order alone. A second-born boy with an older brother is in a different developmental environment than a second-born boy with an older sister, and understanding that difference helps parents be more intentional about what each child specifically needs. If you have two boys, I'd love to know, do you see this dynamic playing out? Tell me in the comments, because the conversation there is genuinely fascinating. Everything we've covered so far could start to feel like a verdict, like the developmental gaps are set, the personality differences are fixed, and all a parent can do is watch it unfold. That's not what the research says. What the research says is more useful than that. The environmental mechanisms are knowable, which means they're influenceable. Here's what the developmental science actually points toward. For your firstborn, the risk is over-scaffolding. The research on firstborns who struggle with anxiety and perfectionism consistently points to environments where adult monitoring was so consistent that the child never developed confidence in their own ability to navigate uncertainty. The adjustment isn't to withdraw, it's to deliberately create low-stakes moments where your firstborn has to figure something out without you. Let them be wrong. Let them try again. The goal is to give them access to the adaptive flexibility that their environment didn't naturally build. For your secondborn, the risk is under scaffolding. The research on laterborns who struggle academically or professionally often points to environments where explicit instruction was rare, where they were expected to figure things out independently before they had the foundational knowledge to do so effectively. The adjustment is to deliberately carve out one-on-one time where the conversational dynamic is just you and them, adult level, patient, complex. Not to compensate for the older sibling's presence, but to give the secondborn regular access to the rich linguistic and cognitive environment that shaped their older siblings' early development. One more thing, and this is perhaps the most practically important finding of all. The sibling relationship itself is a developmental resource, not a complication, not a distraction from parenting, but an active ingredient in both children's growth. The firstborn who teaches their younger siblings something is strengthening their own understanding. The secondborn who negotiates with their older sibling is building social intelligence that no adult can replicate. When you facilitate positive sibling interaction, rather than just managing conflict, you're not just keeping the peace. You're actively building two brains simultaneously. The research on sibling relationship quality as a predictor of adult well-being is striking. Children who report feeling close to their siblings show stronger social adjustment, greater emotional resilience, and, in longitudinal data tracking into adulthood, higher reported life satisfaction. Not because siblings make life easier, because learning to love someone who is genuinely different from you, who you didn't choose, who drives you absolutely crazy sometimes, that is one of the most important developmental experiences a childhood can contain. Share this video with a parent who has 2 kids and has ever whispered, "I don't understand how they can be so different," because now they'll know. And knowing changes everything. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of parent this channel exists for. The ones who want to understand what's actually happening inside their children, not just manage the surface behavior. We go this deep every single week. Subscribing means you'll never miss it. And the next time your kids do something that baffles you, you might just have the framework to understand why. Same parents, same house, completely different people, and now you know exactly why. Thanks for watching. The end screen has more videos in the same world. Pick whichever one calls to you. Thanks for being here. Pick whichever video on the end screen calls to you.